Okay, we are recording. Okay. Hello, everybody. We're about 2 minutes away from class. I'm going to wish you guys a wonderful class. I'm also going to remind you all to mute and use the chat box, if you have any questions, or of course, I'm sure you can raise your hand like I'm doing. I hope you guys have a wonderful Wednesday afternoon. I'll be here if you need me, okay?
All right. Let's see. Overview. Okay. Let's see. In middle. All right.
Mr. Robert, I'd give it about 1 or 2 more minutes. I'm still waiting on about 2 people to pop in.
Okay, good enough.
Okay. Have a great class.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You'll let me know when it's time to start?
Yes, sir. I'll be glad to.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
You have over half of your participants. You can start if you would like, or you can still wait a few minutes, whatever you would like to do.
Well, it'll teach them a lesson, you know?
It is Zoom, right?
As they go on in life,
more laid back with Zoom.
It's a good life lesson. As they go on, they'll learn to be on time. You know, it'll help them on later on when they're building a career or doing a job interview or something like that. It'll be good for them, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Oh, thank you, Michelle, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon, comrades. Last time we kind of laid the foundation of Marxist economics, and the two key ideas that developed out of that. One key idea is that exploitation lies at the heart of how workers relate to capitalist societies. And the second very related idea is that the foundation of profit in a capitalist society is exploitation. And that exploitation idea obviously has inspired political movements, political parties, revolutions. It's had an enormous impact on world history. Nevertheless, for all that practical impact, it has to be said that what was covered so far still seems really theoretical, and I'm sure you've noticed that. And it's not going to get a whole lot less theoretical, but the problem that Marx faces with what we have so far is that it's not really connected to the everyday world we experience. I mean, yes, he's developed what we talked about were ethical ideas about exploitation, and as I say, very powerful. But he had no interest in developing an ethical theory or a theory of ethics. He derided what he called utopian socialism. He was interested in a scientific theory of capitalism, explaining how it worked, explaining what its future would be. And a scientific theory has to be connected to evidence and ultimately to observable phenomena. So something that's self-contained theoretical isn't going to work very well. And as we well know, when we enter the marketplace as buyers or sellers, we don't think in terms of labor values or exchange value of labor power. We experience prices. That's how the economy works for us. Prices are what we think about, what we talk about, what we calculate. So Marx's task, if he wants a scientific theory, is to connect the labor value arena system, which we developed last time, to the everyday world of prices, because that's going to make the theory ultimately scientific. And so he's going to do this in two ways. We'll start as last time with the labor market. And once we handle that, we'll flip over to the products market, just like last time. So when it comes to the labor market, it's a high time. I've gone too long without PowerPoint. It's too scary. So let me, oops, wait a second. Let me share my screen first. That's going to help. Where's that? But share screen. There we go. There. Okay. I hope everybody slideshow. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. So what we're going to do, again, on the labor market side, what Marx needs to do is take the idea that we developed for the labor market, the cost of labor being the exchange value of labor power, and he's got to connect that to the price side of things. In the case of the labor market, of course, the price is what we every day know is a wage. So his connection is in two steps. The first one I'm going to call the floor part of it. He's going to argue that the labor exchange value of labor power creates a floor below which the wage cannot systematically go. And particularly, the connection is going to be direct and simple. He says the exchange value of labor power, the amount of labor time embodied in the worker who shows up at work every day, that's going to be equivalent to the wage that we're all familiar with. By equivalent, I mean simply that the money you make at your job is sufficient, not more than that, but sufficient to buy food, clothing, and shelter that will allow you to show up for work, okay? And so he wants to show these two are equal. So let's start with the floor argument. Floor argument, I think, is relatively easy. Think of what the exchange value of labor power is. It's the minimum that allows you to stay at the job. So if the wage were systematically below that, let's say people couldn't buy enough to eat, then maybe for a while the malnourished they could show up at work, but eventually they're not, and the workforce as a whole is going to disappear if the wage is below that floor. And therefore, capitalists will be forced to bid up that wage to keep their workforce, because capitalism implodes without a workforce. So that's the floor argument. Basically, it can't go lower than the exchange value of labor power for too long, or the capitalism won't survive, and capitalists will react and make sure it survives. So the next step is the ceiling argument. He's also going to argue that very same exchange value of labor power is a ceiling on the wage. The wage cannot rise above that. And let's see what we're doing here. If the wage can't go below the exchange value of labor power, and it can't go above the exchange value of labor power, well, it's got to be equal to the exchange value of labor power. It's got no other wiggle room, okay? So the ceiling argument. The ceiling argument is a little more complicated, but not too bad. Marx introduces the idea that, in his view, capitalism inevitably generates a large pool of unemployed workers, what he calls the industrial reserve army. Now, we're going to postpone for now discussion or evaluation of that argument, so we can stay on track with where we are. So for the sake of argument, temporarily, we're going to assume that's true, that there's an industrial reserve army, this pool of unemployed workers. So now imagine a worker who's working for a wage equal to the exchange value of labor power, goes to the boss and says, I want a raise. Now, this is capitalism, it's not slavery. So implicitly, what the worker is saying is, pay me a higher wage or I'm leaving. The capitalist, however, has this response. I understand you're unhappy with your wage. I get it. But there's a group of people right out the door, referring to the reserve, Industrial Reserve Army, whose wage is zero. And they jump at a chance for the horrible wage that you don't like. So if you need a higher wage, go look for one, but you're not getting one here. The worker, however, is not going to look. The worker's stuck because he knows that any potential employer he goes to is going to give him the same lecture. He's going to say, I've got an industrial reserve army out there. I don't need to hire you. Doesn't have to say that. It will say, take the wage you're getting or take a hike. And the worker over time certainly will learn not to take a hike. So that's basically the argument. We got the floor set up, the ceiling set up. It's the same floor and ceiling. Exchange value of labor power equals the wage. So now we're done with the labor market, unless somebody has a question about it. Well, now we're going to flip to the product market side. And I got to tell you, that's a whole lot more difficult. Okay. Much more complicated. And I got to admit that I'm it teaches stuff. It's tempting to just say, well, there's this problem of connecting the labor values in the final products market to the prices, everyday prices that you see in the products market. But, it's complicated, so let's just move on before somebody gets hurt. But I'm really uncomfortable with doing that because this issue of connecting the labor system, value system, what we developed last time, to prices when it comes to these products, that has just been such a focus of attention, discussion, controversy, not only among Marxist economists, it's engaged across the board, Marxist and non-Marxist, some of the very best minds in economics. And the discussion has gone into the 21st century. So to just kind of pass this by, with a phrase and just move on, just makes me uncomfortable. So here's the compromise solution I've arrived at. What I'm going to do is present to you the most basic version of Marx's understanding of of this problem, which, by the way, is so important, it actually has a name. They've given it a name. It's called the transformation problem, which is short for transforming labor values into prices. And we're going to look at the most basic version of that, even a simplified version of the basic version of that. And we'll do that at least, I think it'll be sufficient for you to understand what the transformation problem really is and what Marx's proposed solution to the transformation problem is, how he connected the labor values to prices and connected his theory, very abstract theory, to the real world, so to speak. But when it gets to the level of real complications, that's when we'll punt, okay, and call it a day on that. So the transformation problem. If you're connecting to a world of prices, you're now talking about the market world of supply and demand. We no longer can have this nice little confined example of one worker, one capitalist. We have to expand because prices are determined by markets. Markets are determined by supply and supply and demand is defined by lots of traders, buyers and sellers. So we have to expand our analysis to include, so to speak, a whole economy rather than just two people, capitalist and worker. But Marx understands this, and in volume 3 of Capital, he develops a kind of model economy with 5 industries to illustrate how he approaches the transformation problem. To simplify it, as I said we would, we're going to use just 2 industries. So, but with that understood, the table I'm going to show you just now is really based on the table that Marx presents in volume 3 of Capital. So let's look at what this is all about. Okay, you have 2 industries, evocatively called Industry 1 and Industry 2. Just tremendous job of branding there. We can leave it like that, like Marx does, because it really doesn't matter what these industries are, as it turns out. Now, you may react to that. It would be understandable to say, what do you mean it doesn't matter? Why am I bothering to distinguish 2 industries if it doesn't matter what they are? But let's be clear, what doesn't matter is what they produce. If you want something concrete in your mind, we can, let's say industry one is the steel industry and produces appliances and that sort of thing. And we could say industry two is the textile industry, produces sweaters and that sort of thing. But what matters for this example, not in general, but what matters for this example is not what they produce, but how they produce it. The means of production, so to speak. And that's what we're going to get to right now and show that distinction. So first of all, we imagine capitalists have money to invest, capital to invest. And they can put it into two buckets. The first bucket is what Marx calls constant capital, labeled with a C. It's capital because it's the capital as we already usually understand it in businesses, things like machinery. And it's constant because, as we saw last time, that labor value, the labor time embedded in that machinery gets transferred, added to the final product cost that we calculated last time. We add up all the parts, the labor parts of it, and we got a final cost for the product in labor value terms. So it's constant because whatever that number is the number that gets added into the cost of the final product. We see now industry 1 and 2 are different because industry 1 requires an investment or gets an investment of 80 units of constant capital, and industry 2 gets an investment of 70 units of constant capital. This next bucket that the capitalists can put their money into is labor power. They have to buy workers. And Marx calls this variable capital, capital because it's an investment, money, financial capital that's going in, so it's a kind of capital. Variable because unlike the constant capital case we saw last time, when you buy labor power and that's applied into the production process, injected into the production process, the value expands. It doesn't stay with just the labor power. More is produced in value from that labor power. So he calls it variable capital. And now we see that the two industries actually are different, and it's going to turn out in a very important way. Industry 1 has relatively more constant capital than variable capital. In modern econ speak, we would say industry 1 has relatively labor capital intensive compared to industry 2. And we see that industry 2 has relatively more labor power, variable capital, than industry 1. And so we would say, again, in econ speak, that it's relatively labor intensive compared to industry 1. But Marx wants also to make that relative thing a little more precise. And so he defines what he calls the organic composition of capital, just divides the constant by the variable capital to see the relative balance between the two. So in industry 1's case, it's 80 divided by 20, which is equal to 4. In industry 2's case, it's 70 divided by 30, which is equal to 2 1/3. This he calls the organic composition of capital. And it turns out that this organic, oops, what am I doing? There we go. This organic composition is going to be the key basis, foundation on which he sort of examines and tries to solve the transformation problem. Ultimately, remember, that's our ultimate goal here. Now, so far, we have the capitalist investment in machinery and labor, constant and variable capital. But that's the cost of doing business. That's not why the capitalist is there to pay money. The capitalist is in there to make money. And that is produce surplus value through this production process. Now, last time, when we looked at that process, if you remember the example, we had a 10-hour workday. The worker works 5 of those hours to offset the cost of the labor power the capitalist has to pay. And the remaining 5 hours of the workday are uncompensated. They appear as surplus value profit for the capitalist. So that's 1-to-1, 5 hours for labor cost, 5 hours for the surplus. It doesn't have to be that way, as I said last time. That's not theoretically dictated. But in this case, we're going to adopt the same idea just to keep things simple. And once again, Marx wants to have a formula for it. We're not going to really use these formulas in a very mathematical way, but he does. That's some of the simplification I'm going to undertake here. But in the case we looked at, we'll adopt the same idea. The rate of exploitation, surplus value divided by variable capital, is 100%. That is 1 for 1. You take the surplus value and you divide it by the variable capital. If it's 1 for 1, this would be in industry 1, its variable capital must be 20. So if it's 1 for 1, it must be 20 divided by that 20 variable capital. Surplus value must be 20. So we have 20 over 20, which is 1, multiplied by 100, you get the percent. So the rate of exploitation in our original example is 100%, and we're going to take it that way too. We're going to say the rate of exploitation is 100%, and that, wait a second, now I want to back up here. The rate of exploitation is 100%, and that means 20 units of variable capital in industry 1 will produce 20 units of surplus value in industry 1. In industry 2, there's 30 units of variable capital. It's 1 for 1. If it's 100% rate of exploitation, again, we're going to have 30 divided by the surplus value divided by 30 has got to be 1 for 1. So it's going to be equal to 30 if the rate is 100%. So there'll be 30 units of surplus value in industry 2. The rate of exploitation, again, is 100% in this particular example. In the real world, it could be 150%. It could be 30%. It just varies. Maybe people will have to work a fraction of the day to make up for their cost. Maybe people have to work 9/10 of the day in order to make up for their costs. It just varies industry by industry. I'm sorry, it varies economy by economy. But it's, in this case, we said it's 100%. It's not theoretically dictated. It's just circumstances applying in that economy. But what's not arbitrary, what in fact is theoretically dictated, is that whatever this rate of exploitation is, in this case 100%, it's got to be equal across both industries. And it's not hard to see why. Remember, we're going to assume the workday is the same in each industry. Last time it was 10 hours. We'll make it 10 hours. Everybody is just being paid a sufficient amount to make up for their room and board, so to speak, keep them alive as workers. That's going to be the same across all workers. They're all getting the same exchange value of labor wage. So it will take the same number of hours per day out of the 10 hours a day. In this case, it's 5 hours to make up for that. And there'll be 5 hours equal amount to be the surplus value. So the rate of exploitation in both industries has got to be 100%. Again, if it were 8 hours every day to make up what it cost, it would be, the rate of exploitation would be different, but it would be the same in both industries. It would take 8 hours in each industry. In this case, it takes 5 hours in each industry. So that's something that has to be equal, theoretically. As we see, because the rate of exploitation is 100%, the surplus value has got to be equal to, in each case, the variable capital. 20 equals 20, 30 equals 30, because the rate of exploitation is 100%. All right. Okay. So we now know the profit. Okay. We now know the total capital in, we now know the profit that each of these industries is generating. 20 units in industry 1, 30 units in industry 2. We know, the phrase is, capitalism is a profit loss system, and profit drives capitalism, profit drives capitalism. In one sense, we're done. We have produced profit for each of these industries, and in our little model economy for the whole economy, since there are only 2 industries in this economy. But there's a little complication that's important here. If surplus value, the absolute amount of it, is not really, despite all this talk about profit, 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 it's not really what the capitalists are interested in after all. Think of it this way. You meet a friend and your friend tells you, I made $1,000 in profit from an investment last year. Now, if it's a casual conversation, you want to keep it nice and simple. You say, oh, congratulations, great. If it's Facebook, you get a bunch of likes. Oh, you're the best person, investor, and so on. A lot of praising and stuff like that. But the reality is you don't have a clue as to whether your friend made a good investment or not. Not a clue. Because in order to know whether it's a good investment, you have to know how much that friend had to invest to get that profit, right? I mean, if your friend invested $100 and made $1,000 worth of profit, well, what is that profit as a multiple of the investment? Think of it as 1,000 divided by 100 is 10, multiply by 100 to get a percent. That's 1,000% rate of return. That was a really terrific investment. Congratulations are in order. On the other hand, if your friend had invested $1 million and got $1,000 of profit out of it, that's 1,000 divided by a million, just to see what the multiple of the investment, the profit was. That's 1/1,000th multiplied by 100. That's 1/10 of 1% rate of return. That was a terrible rate of return, terrible investment. So from the absolute profit that each industry gets, you cannot know whether this is a good investment or not. But that is what capitalists want to know. Did I use my money the right way? Did I invest? I had other things I could do with my money. In industry one, there was 100 units of investment. In industry two, there was 100 units of investment. By the way, those don't have to be equal. That's just, I'll get back to that in a moment, but they could be unequal. But in this case, they're equal. The total is 100. So we want to know what was the rate of return, not simply the amount of profit. So to do that, we divide, as we just did, we divide the surplus value by the total capital invested. How much money did it take to get that surplus value? We'll divide 20 by 100 to get the rate of return in industry one. See, Marx has rigged the numbers here to add up the total capital to equal to 100 in both cases. As I indicated, there's no law that says it has to be equal, or certainly not 100. Marx isn't fooling anybody or trying to get something past you. He just did this to make the arithmetic easy, and sure enough, it becomes very easy. To get the rate of return for industry one, we simply divide surplus value 20 by the investment 100, which is 20%. Okay, just like we did with the $1,000 of profit and the $100 investment. In industry two, it's 30 divided by 100. Surplus value is 30. Total capital is again 100, 30%. And now we know what we want to know. The rate of return from each industry, 20% in industry one, 30% in industry two, okay? Within the labor value system, within the world we talked about last time, we've now generalized it to a whole economy, but we really still in that labor value system, embodied labor world. We're done. We have laid out the story, not just for one capitalist and one worker, but the whole economy. But Houston, we have a problem, or maybe I should say Trier, we have a problem. Because what the labor value analysis says here is, if this were the case, if industry one were producing 20% rate of return and industry two 30% return, industry one would hemorrhage capital. Think of it this way. The annual production cycle, say, is a year. And for sake of simplicity, let's say we use up all our capital during that. Rate of depreciation is 100%. So you have to stay around for industry one, capitalists have to reinvest. They have to refurbish their capital. They have to buy 80 units or more capital. They have to get workers again, either hire or rehire 20 units of labor power, okay? and start over. But they're not going to do that. They're not going to do that. I mean, they are going to flee industry one because industry two has a 50% higher rate of return. Okay. Now, they can't flee instantly. You know, they can't snap their fingers. I said industry one is steel. So, you know, you can't snap your fingers and turn smelters into industry two is textile, smelters into looms. But once again, once the product production cycle is over and it's now necessary to reinvest your 100 of capital, they're not going to do it by putting it in industry one. They're going to go to industry two, which means industry one implodes. And the reason why this is a problem for the labor theory of value analysis is that Marx looked around and he said, you know, industrial structure is pretty stable. I mean, if he looked back in economic history, if he looked back, he knew that for a long time there had been a steel industry and a textile industry. And he had every anticipation that for the foreseeable future, there would be a steel industry and a textile industry. So a theory that says these industries are unstable and they're going to collapse and hemorrhage capital, that's theory is not workable. And so he has to somehow show how these industries stabilize despite the implication of the labor theory of value up to this point, that they're not stable. And the trick will be, this is where he invokes prices, the price mechanism, as we're going to see. This is where the price story comes in to the labor theory of value story. In combination, they're going to solve this transformation problem by showing how these labor values translate into prices. Okay, so let's think about what's necessary. We want a system that's stable, which means, Marx says, that for one industry not to hemorrhage capital to another industry, they both have to have the same rate of return. Otherwise, there would be that instability that we're looking at right here. And we can go further than that. We can say what that same rate of return is. It's the average rate of return for the economy. Think of it this way. Suppose one industry had a below average rate of return. Well, by the definition of average, there's got to be another industry that has an above average rate of return to sort of counterbalance that. So that means that one industry has a below average rate of return. Another industry, therefore, has an above average, a higher rate of return. The first industry hemorrhages capital. Or conversely, imagine there's some industry that has an above average rate of return, above average for the economy. Well, by definition of average, there's got to be some other industry that has a below average rate of return to counterbalance that higher rate of return. Well, that means that lower rate of return industry is going to hemorrhage capital once again. The only way that's not going to happen is, once again, if the rates of return are equal, and as we've now seen, they've got to equal the average rate of return. All this is kind of logical. It has nothing to do with prices so far, but this is exactly where labor theory of value and prices come into the rescue. Because Marx says, because we have these values, constant capital, variable capital, and all the rest, from our labor theory of value, we can calculate exactly what that average rate of return is. And that's what we're going to do now, not too hard. So for the economy, we see that industry one has constant capital of 80. Industry two has constant capital of 70 for a total economy amount of capital of 150. Remember, we're going to calculate the total capital, the total surplus value. So we'll be able to calculate the rate of return for the economy as a whole. What we just did right now, I want to pause for a second. What we just did right now, in one sense, is trivial. We added 80 and 70 and got 150. Duh. But in another sense, this is what we did is theoretically very significant. Because remember, 80 represents 80 units of embodied labor. 70 in industry 2 represents 70 units of embodied labor. We came across this issue at the very, very beginning of class last time. Remember, Adam Smith and David Ricardo are wondering, how can I imagine exchanging apples and oranges? How do people find a common denominator to compare them? They said, their apples are not the same as oranges, but if we convert them to the amount of labor time necessary to bring the apples and the oranges to market, then we have a common denominator when we're comparing likes and likes. So the reason why we're able to add the industry 1 capital and the industry 2 capital and get 150 in a meaningful way was because we had translated that into a common metric, labor units or labor time units, and we get 150. If we hadn't done that, if we hadn't done that translation, if we had, say, 80 smelters and 70 looms, we would have 80 and 70, 150, what? Smelter, I mean, it's like adding ounces and inches. There's no meaningful answer. You can't, when I say that's wrong, it doesn't mean, oh, the answer is really 160. No, there's no answer to that question. What is 80 smelters and 70 looms? It's just a meaningless question. As Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, once said, it's not even wrong. I mean, it's just, this allows us, the labor theory of value, Marx argues, allows us to make this addition possible. That's the key contribution of the labor theory of value here. So let's continue. We're going to need total variable capital of 50. So now we have a total capital of 200, 150 plus 50. Now we need our surplus value. Okay, that's 20 plus 30 is 50. So now we have our total capital of 200. We have our total surplus value of 50. Our rate of return is going to be 50 over 200, surplus value divided by the capital needed to get that. And so now we have the economy-wide rate of return, 50 divided by 200, 25%. We now know what the average for the economy is. We see that industry 1 is 5 percentage points below average. Industry 2 is 5 percentage points above average. Well, industry 2 has an obvious way to boost its rate of return to keep the capital reinvested, keep it itself alive for another production cycle. It simply raises its price by 5 units. And therefore, its surplus value will become 25 instead of 20, and 25 divided by total capital of 100 means a 25% rate of return for industry 1, and that's the target value we have right here. 25% of return is the average. Oops. That's the target. So we see why industry 1 would want to raise its prices to make sure that they live to fight another day. Industry 2 is a different story. It's got a 30% rate of return, and for them to get a 25% rate of return, they're going to have to lower their profits by 5 percentage points. Now, they're not going to do that just to make Marxist economists happy. What would compel them to lower their price? Well, here's what would compel them. Just briefly, let's return to industry 1. The total value, the exchange value of what they produce, when we did this last time, we add constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value. Okay, so we have 80 plus 20 plus 25, because they raised their price. That's 125. The exchange value of what they're producing is equal to 125. They can exchange it for 125 something else that requires 125 units of a labor time, just like the deer and the table example. Industry 2, okay, it's going to say, oh, I'm sorry, let's stay with industry 1. Okay, to stay in business, though, they're going to have to take that 125. 80 of it's going to have to get reinvested for constant capital. 20 is going to have to get reinvested to hire workers or rehire workers. So that's going to leave them 25 units to play with, to exchange for whatever is else in the economy available, because otherwise they're just stuck with a bunch of washing machines or something. So they want to exchange those. Along comes industry 2. Their value, total value, exchange value is 70 constant, 30 variable capital. Surplus value is 30, that's 130. But 70 of that has to be reinvested to have a second production of washing machines. And so they have to put in 70 for that, 30 to rehire the workers. They're left with 30 units of surplus value to buy whatever else is available in the economy, or else they're stuck with a pile of sweaters. The problem for industry 2, however, is they have 30 units to play with of exchange value, but the industry 1 folks, and they're the only ones left in this little economy, they've only got 25 to exchange with. So 25 to 25 would leave 5 units of exchange value that industry 2 has that they can't exchange. In other words, they can call it profit all they want, but they can't realize it until they exchange it for something. I mean, if it makes it easier, think of it, industry 1 capitalists with their surplus value have 25 bucks, and industry 3 people want to exchange it, and they say, we want 30 bucks for it. That's the exchange value of what we've produced. But there's only $25 out there. So obviously, unless they want to be, industry 2 capitalists want to be stuck with a bunch of sweaters, they've got to lower the price, so to speak, to clear the market, to exchange for the values that are available to exchange with. So they're going to have to lower their prices by 5 units in order to have a 25 unit exchange value that will in fact meet with the 25 unit of exchange value that industry 1 capitalists have to offer. So notice we are now down in a situation where through the price mechanism, both industries have produced a 25% rate of return. They both adapted their industry to produce 25% rate of return in each industry, which is the economy-wide average, and this produces a stable world. So to speak, the labor system of value and the price system work hand in hand to produce this result. Without the labor value system, you couldn't have calculated the economy-wide average. There would not be an economy-wide average. Without the price system, the system would be unstable, contrary to fact, just reality. Okay? So this is Marx's setting up an answer to the transformation problem. He's transformed these labor values embedded in the products of industry 1 and 2 into prices. Industry 1 lowers the exchange value measurement by 5 units through the price system. Industry 2, through the price system, lowers the exchange value by 5 units. Industry 1 raises it, industry 2 lowers it. He stabilized the system. We kind of reversed engineered, said, what would it take for the industry to be stable? And he showed how the system would stabilize to that point. Okay, but this is, and Marx understands this, it's a Pyrrhic victory. Remember, the big project for Marx is to show that capitalism destroys itself. It is unstable. It eventually falls apart and gives way to socialism. And what he's done now is stabilize the system to show it's stable. You know, so this is he won the battle, but he lost the war. So this leads to Marx's next stage of discussion about this issue of production. This is what stage is what he calls simple reproduction, and I think you can see why. Every round, the capitalists produce stuff, they exchange it, and then they start over again, producing the same product with the same amount of constant capital and the same amount of variable capital. They live to fight another day, but the fight is the same. Year after year, it's the same 2 industries, same process. Marx then says, but, well, you know, there's extended capital, extended reproduction. because he understands that capitalists don't have to take their surplus value, 25 in each case, and simply consume with it, be pigs with it. They can abstain from consumption. They can save. They can reinvest in their businesses. And he knows fully well that capitalists do that. In fact, even in Marx's time, there was the abstemious theory of profit. People, Marx felt they were just trying to justify capitalism, would say that capitalists deserve their profit because it's the result of their abstention, their savings, frugality, rather than consuming it. And Marx's answer is just say that's 180 degrees wrong. You can save because you have profit. You don't have profit because you save. But that said, he said capitalists he understood didn't necessarily consume it all. And particularly in those early days of capitalism, when people were building businesses, they reinvested like crazy. Think of startup companies today, reinvesting constantly, living off of credit cards. So one way you could do that is simply, let's say, whatever amount of money you want to reinvest instead of consume, you apportion it, in the case of Industry 1, 80-20, 4-to-1, constant to variable capital. In Industry 2, you take that, whatever you want to save and reinvest, you do it 2 1/3 to 1, 2 1/3 constant capital to 1 unit of variable capital. Marx called this extended reproduction. But he had another idea about what capitalists could do with this investment, something more creative. And this, in fact, is a genuine contribution that Marx introduced to the economic study of economics. He really was the first one to concentrate on this possibility. He said they could go beyond extended reproduction. They can introduce new technology to increase the productivity of the system. In other words, he focused most of all on labor-saving technology. They could introduce a new kind of production process that would get more product for the same amount of labor. And this, it turns out, leads to a downward spiral for capitalism. So I'm going to let the big guy talk for himself. Okay, so this is a quotation from, again, volume 3 of Capital. So this is Marx. No capitalist ever voluntarily introduces a new method of production, no matter how much more productive it may be, so long as it reduces the rate of profit. By the way, in a sane world, Marx would say, in a socially managed world, a less anarchic world, socialistic world, a new method might be produced simply because it saves labor, even if it reduces profit, even if it gives workers more money, not less. But this is capitalism. They're not going to do it unless they make more money out. So long as it reduces the rate of profit. Yet every such new method of production cheapens the commodities. In other words, you're getting more product for the same amount of labor. Hence, the capitalist sells them originally above their prices of production. Think of it this way. You have one business in Industry 1. This person has thought of a new steel-making production process, okay? Pocket steel like they have today. This business is not so large that it changes in any noticeable way the amount of products out there in the total market. That's not affected. It just means that this capitalist can now sell more products at the original cost, at the cost that was dictated by the higher production values before the new technology is introduced. So this new capitalist with the new technology is going to make super profits because this capitalist has a lower cost of production but can sell it at the original prices, which were predicated on a much less efficient mode of production. Okay, so he pockets the difference between their cost of production and the market prices of the same commodities, reduced at their higher costs of production. In other words, he's beating the brains in of all his competitors. He can do this because the average labor time required socially for the reduction of these latter commodities is higher than the labor time required for the new method of production. Each unit under the new method of production requires less labor than each unit produced under the old method. But he says very blandly, but competition makes it general. I mean, essentially, the capitalists he's competing with glom onto the idea that there's new production. Maybe they have spies, in the business, but they glom onto the fact that there's this new technology, and they pile in with the new technology. This is in modern social science speak, we call this a collective action problem. What's rational for each capitalist to do, that is introduce this next technology, may be terribly bad for them as a whole. What's individually rational is not necessarily good for the whole. The collective action problem. He puts it simply, competition makes it general. Everybody does this. Think of, to get a sense of this, imagine you're at a restaurant with friends. Restaurants these days often are designed to increase the noise level. They have bare brick walls and this kind of stuff, because young people like it. The sound level is exciting, but of course it's annoying for people our age. So you at your table you start talking a little louder, but of course that means everybody else has got to start talking loud, which means you have to jack up the volume at your table. Before you know it, everybody's screaming at each other across the table, and you're not hearing or being heard any better than you were before the process started. That's a classic case of a collective action problem. Everybody's worse off, even though what each table did was rational. So what happens is all this product just comes spewing forth, okay? Now this makes a noticeable difference for supply. Supply increases dramatically, and we know when the supply increases, prices fall, and there follows a fall in the rate of profit, which, as he says, is therefore wholly independent of the will of the capitalist. It's a collective action problem. They're individually acting in a perfectly rational, sensible way. But because there's no collective organization of the economy, read socialism, a collective organization of the economy, they beat each other's brains. So he calls the tendency for the rate of profit to fall the most important law of modern political economy. This was in the Grundrisse. Translated, it's the foundation for the critique of political economy, this massive volume, which was never published in his lifetime. He calls this the most important law of modern political economy. Why? It initiates this downward spiral of capitalism. There's a profit squeeze, right? Industries start, as the rate of profit falls, some industries can't keep up. They close shop, they lay off workers. The industrial reserve army starts growing. Other industries pick up some of that market share. The scale gets bigger. The production gets even bigger. Economies of scale, but that means the crisis gets even bigger because now even more production is driving the prices down even more. So this downward spiral in which profit squeezes simply squeeze out capitalist after capitalist after capitalist who can't keep up with the competition until Marx says the thing goes bluey. Okay. So this is the way capitalism works for Marx. This is what brings about its destruction. This is so important. I'm going to take the last few minutes to sort of lay this out. I sort of verbally did a fast move through this. But remember, the rate of profit is surplus value divided by constant capital plus variable capital. The denominator is the total capital that has to be invested. The cost of the capitalist. S is the profit they get out of this. This is for the economy as a whole. So S divided by C plus V, F surplus divided by total capital is the rate of return. What's the payoff from the investment? When the capitalists invent new technology, they put in this new technology, the C goes up. The amount of C goes up. They invest in more constant capital than otherwise they had. Proportionally more constant capital now is in the system because of this new technology invested in, labor-saving technology. the amount of C goes up, but as you can see from the formula, C is in the denominator. It makes the denominator bigger, makes the fraction smaller. S is now divided by a bigger denominator, and therefore the rate of profit goes down. That's what Marx is talking about. Okay? He recognized that there were kind of offsetting factors here. For example, initially, what the capitalists are producing with this new technology is new consumption goods, cheaper consumption goods, not new, but cheaper consumption goods. Prices are going down. Think of like computers, laptops, everything related to computers. The prices have hemorrhaged in cost. Solar power is compared to about 10, 15 years ago. The cost is 5% of what it used to be because of this huge ramp up of technology. In the case of solar power, it's due to China. In the case of computers, it's due to Silicon Valley. Anyway, but at some point, this productivity affects the very technology, the new technology itself. That becomes cheaper to produce. And so that would reduce the constant capital cost. Refurnishing yourself with capital now becomes cheaper. When it was new technology, it was expensive. Oh, the latest iPhone, the blah, blah, blah. But if you don't want an iPhone 15, you buy an iPhone 13 for a lot cheaper. The older technology is cheaper. So that will drive C down and therefore drive the rate of profit up a little bit. But Marx thinks that this only gives temporary relief. In the long run, that drive for new technology, new innovation, new profit opportunities will collectively drive the rate of profit down. Capitalism will get a minor reprieve by making the older technology, it used to be the new technology, cheaper. But in the long run, the drive for new technology will overcome any of those tendencies that drive the rate of profit down. Okay? But that's not all of it. As I mentioned, this discussion has been taking place not simply in the 1860s with Marx into the 21st century. And people have noticed some issues. V represents, once again, labor power, right? The cost of labor power. Well, some of the things produced with all this new productivity are the goods and things that workers need to survive. If that cost goes down, then the exchange value of labor power goes down. V goes down, right? It becomes cheaper to pay a worker, even if that worker needs to stay alive. What the worker needs to stay alive has now become cheaper. Think of food. It wasn't that long ago where in the United States and many countries today, to this day, food would be 30, 35% of people's budget. It's now about 19, 20% of people's budget or less, even with the food inflation, okay? If that price goes down through agribusiness, industrialization of agriculture and all the rest, fertilizers, chemistry, and all the rest, well, the cost of food goes down and the exchange value of labor goes down. So V goes down. That's the variable capital component. That means the denominator gets smaller and the rate of profit goes up. So this can be very confusing. We got a lot of torque on this fraction. C is going up, it's going down, it's going up. V is going down. Which way is it? I mean, what's going to happen to the rate of profit when the dust settles? Marx was absolutely convinced, but didn't have a really detailed formal argument of this, that rate of profit would be driven down in the long run. But what is actually the case? Well, is the rate of profit higher than the original? I mean, granted, the first capitalist makes a huge killing, super profits, but that gets competed down. But does it fall to a point lower than the super profit level, but still above the original profit level? Does it fall to a level that just equals the original profit level? Or does it fall, as Marx thought, below the original rate of profit level? It seems to be we have no clear answer to this question. And theoretically, under some conditions, any one of these things could happen. But then a bright group of economists starting in the 1960s really worked on this much more carefully than Marx did, starting with Okishio In 1961, John Romer, 81. These are some of the top names, but not all of them, but worked on this problem by any means. Romer, by the way, is to this day has a joint appointment in political science and economics at Yale, and David Laban, who's at Brooklyn College. Yay, Brooklyn College. Anyway, they showed that given Marx's assumptions about the economy, that the final rate of profit would rise relative to the original if, and this is the key if each investment by a capitalist in new technology was individually, that is economically rational to do. If there wasn't, then anything could happen. But if it was individually rational for those individual capitalists to invest in that new technology, then when the dust settled, the rate of profit would fall from the super profit, but still be above the original rate of profit. New technology would drive the rate of profit up, not down, as Marx expected. Now, I don't want to tell you that this is the end of the story. There are Marxists who push back on this. These are the way that Okishio and Romer and Laban have done this is a very formal mathematical way. Nobody has found errors in their mathematics, but these people who push back say they've misinterpreted Marx and so on. As you can see here, I could go into it, but I think the guys who argue for a higher rate of profit win the game. But the point here is that we have a tremendous story about what's going to happen to capitalism and a prediction about rates of profit and the collapse of capitalism. We're going to leave this, however, for next time. We're going to continue with Marx's story and pretend that he's right, pretend that the rate of profit is falling. By the way, people have studied this extensively empirically, not just theoretically, and there's no clear answer. Theoretically, I think there's a reasonably clear answer, but in Marxist theory. But empirically, it's not clear what the tendency of the rate of profit is. Nobody has really decisively convinced anyone that whether it's falling, staying the same, or rising. They just don't know. But one thing I want to alert you to here, and then this will conclude the class. We've talked about, even if Marx is granted his original theory and his idea of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, we've talked about the falling down of capitalism, the collapse of capitalism in an odd way, because Marx is the guy about the working class, right? You know, Marx is the guy about the working class. He's all about workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And this entire story is all about capitalists and their innovations and their dynamic and all the rest. The workers are like bystanders here. What happened? Well, in our next class, we're going to talk about politics finally. And that's when the workers are going to come into their own. What this process of falling rates of profit does is drive the system to the edge of the cliff, and the working class will push it over the cliff. So that will be next time. Once again, as last time, if anybody wants to hang in there, be happy to answer questions or interested in hearing your comments and so forth. But everybody, formally speaking, has complete permission to leave with no loss of face at all. So as I say, I will, let's see, where's I, share. No, I don't know how to screen pause. Stop share. Okay, here I am. So anyway, everybody is free to leave. It's a nice day out there. But if anybody has questions or comments, I didn't see anything. It's hard when you're sharing the screen to see whether there are things in the chat.
Share screen. Hello?
Hi, yeah, gotcha.
Okay. I don't know if this is directly bearing on what you were talking about today. It was a little difficult for me to follow. And maybe it's more connected to what you're promising for next month.
Okay.
But I was thinking about something that happened culturally in the United States because of the Second World War, when millions of men went off to the armed services, and they had to be replaced in the workplace by women who were willing to work at lower wages than the men were, and they were paid lower wages throughout World War II in most occupations. And what was discovered during the war was that women in many, many industries, in fact, I would almost say all industries, are equally as capable of doing the work as men. So when World War II ended and the soldiers came back, the big employers would lay off the women and hire men back who were demanding higher wages. Now, if they had thought about it and they could have retained the women to do the same job that men would be doing at lower wages, why would they not hire women instead and let the guys go off to college to the GI Bill?
Oh, it's a good question, and I mean, labor markets are really complicated things. I mean, it's obviously a whole area of economics, labor economics. But let me just make a couple observations. One is the idea that wages were low when women were working back in the factories while the men were fighting in Europe and in the Pacific. That wasn't simply a bunch of kind of greedy workers who were sexist as well, and greedy employers and sexist as well. What the government, it was a government policy to institute wage controls. And in fact, one of the reasons we have employer-supplied health insurance, which is a crazy way to do things, I'll just say it is true. It's an opinion, but I think it's so obviously true. It's a crazy way to do things, but employers were trying to circumvent those wage controls. They got a ruling that from the IRS, in fact, that those even though it's a kind of a wage or insurance benefits, it wouldn't be counted as income for violating the wage caps. And so the wages were low in part because the government enforced them to be low. They wanted factors of production to be as cheap as possible so they can produce as much as possible for the war effort. And so some of that was not due to kind of, as I say, sexism on the part of employers. It was due to the fact that whoever was around would have had to get a wage that didn't keep pace with the supply and demand, because supply was reduced dramatically, and government was pumping up demand by huge deficit spending to finance the war. So when they come back is another kind of angle, because the wage price controls are lifted and there's roaring inflation as a result. It's very hard to portion causality here between the perfidy of employers and simply culturally biased choices, because all these GIs came. I mean, it also caused huge, as I say, inflation generally, but huge inflation in real estate, because these GIs, people got married younger then. They came back and they wanted to get married, start families, and the housing shortage. Obviously, housing was not a high priority during World War II. Tanks and planes were. So there was a big pent-up demand and relative shortage of supply. Cities started introducing rent controls and things like that. But with that kind of problem, one is inflation and shortage of housing. People want to get married. I think more and more women and then decided the woman would raise the family and the guy would go out to work, and it was the only manageable thing, as opposed to hiring somebody to take care of the kids and you know, all the rest that you have to do. So I think some of that is cultural choices. It's still true today. I don't think any, you know, I don't think, I'm getting into a tough area here and I could get myself in trouble. I think most of the studies, the modern economic studies, show that and Claudia Golden, who recently won a Nobel Prize in economics, did path-breaking stuff on women in the labor force. The wage gap between men and women now is in terms of just sheer discrimination is negligible. And it's mostly due to different career patterns that women have. And they take time out to raise families, have kids and things like that. And that's a structural discrimination, but it's not the same as an employer saying, you're not going to just arbitrarily pay you less. So with a different work pattern, you get a different outcome in terms of long-term wages or long-term salaries, professional histories and things like that. So I think some of that cultural bias, as I say, I don't think it's legal today, and I don't actually think it's very much embodied in the standard big corporate employers either. A lot of it seems to be just a function of cultural and social values and institutions that we have that keep women at a lower wage scale systematically than men. So it would surprise me, to say the least, if it didn't, that same cultural pattern wasn't enforced in 1946 and 47 and more so. So I don't know how much to attribute to that and how much to attribute to the fact that employers were keeping women's wages low and they suddenly had a change of heart and they gave up profits in order to raise wages for men. I think it was they understood that under the conditions they wouldn't get people to work for them if they paid a wage that was not a living wage for a family. And whereas single women did not need a living wage to work for a family, by and large, they lived in their parents' house, and what their reservation wages is put, as is sometimes put, was lower. They could earn money, help out, and most everything was relatively cheap for them because housing was cheap because their parents provided it, and so on. They lived in a group that food per person was cheaper. So anyway, so I don't know how much of it to attribute to discrimination. Let me just say, from Marx, going back to Marxism, Marxists today might talk about these sorts of things, but by and large, the standard Marxist line is Marx was very, very aware of discrimination against women in the workplace and the maltreatment of women in the workplace. But for him, the worker was kind of non-gendered. Workers were workers, and they were all exploited. And you can tell, for example, when it came to women and race, when Bernie Sanders was running in 2016, he's an old socialist, and he was just so uncomfortable with anything but, we're talking about workers, the working class versus the billionaires. And he had to be kind of really pushed for political survival to talk about racial issues and issues about women and things like that, because I think in his heart of hearts, he doesn't think that's where the fundamental issue is. It's the economic structure of a capitalist society. I showed you the chapter title from one of his recent book. He thinks it's capitalism. It's not gender discrimination. It's not racial discrimination. The bottom line is capitalism. And I think that's the way most Marxists would want to sort out the difference in wages, different groups of people.
Thank you very much.
Sure. I'm sorry to hear that you found it hard to follow. Don't hesitate to just raise your hand and say, whoa, slow down. Could you go over that in some other way? Okay.
I liked the collective, whatever, screaming in restaurants thing. That was a
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
I've experienced it. I don't know about you. And it really, and so I understand it's really true. Or restaurant owners drive up, not all restaurants, but in restaurants that are designed to be crowded, to attract crowds as opposed to just an elite, high-paying segment of the customer base. They like, noisy environments. They like people to go in, eat, and get out, not to linger, not to enjoy conversation. Just it doesn't. You don't have to hear a lot to stare at your phone. So,
I I had an experience in Detroit. We moved from Detroit to Watkinsville just about a year ago, but there was a restaurant in a very nice area of the Detroit suburbs, which reconstructed the insides and made everything made of iron.
yeah.
And I went to this restaurant with a bunch of old friends. We were all older people, half of us wearing hearing aids,
Yeah.
and half of us left our hearing aids at home. So,
Yeah,
we went into the restaurant, and we immediately said, "Holy mackerel, we can't hear anything in here." And we went up to the management and told them, this reconstruction you did, this redesign is horrible. You should do something about making it quieter. And they did. And we walked out of the restaurant, and about 2 months later we went back, and they had put
Oh,
some padding around. It was amazing.
oh, that's
Yeah.
great. That's great. It's funny. And when I've been in China, at a restaurant, I remember an early dinner I had out in China with some Chinese guy, and he takes us to this. He says, "This is a great restaurant, very modern, very nice, and things like that." And the sound level was just, I mean, it's excruciating.
Huh.
And this wasn't. It turns out that Chinese people as a whole, it's just, I mean, I think they have this image of being these, very phlegmatic or taciturn, tightly wound people. And it's just the opposite. It's true. I mean, it's just generalizing. I mean, very animated, excited, big groups, enjoying themselves, having a great time. And this is true up and down, from the little kids to the grandparents in this case. It's not just young people. And so we're screaming at this guy to get heard and trying to hear him. And we say it's some time, trying to sound neutral about this. It's really loud in here. And he says, "Isn't it great?" No, it's not great. It's terrible. But yeah, so some of this is a cultural thing, and some of it obviously is age related. I mean, it's not just hearing. I mean, if anything, young people should want the volume lower because they can hear better. They don't need higher volume. But yeah, they do seem, it's the excitement level. I remember when I can't remember, I was a young teenager, went to a club in the Village in New York, and it was the first electric band I'd ever heard in person. And it was just unreal. And I was at the age where I was supposed to be able to appreciate that, and my ears were ringing for hours afterwards. And so it's been a problem for a long time. And yeah,
Well, it serves you right for going into hear one of those bands.
yeah, I know. It was a great group called the Blues Project. Al Cooper and I'm trying to think, there was a Michael Goldfield, a guitarist, just phenomenal musicians. But they really, I mean, it was like they're trying to hide their musicianship by raising the volume. If they lowered it, some people fake it by raising the volume. These guys didn't have to do it.
You should have gone to Birdland.
Yeah, right, exactly, exactly. Or the half note. That was that was traditional jazz club. Any Marxist questions?
Hey, Bob?
Yeah.
Hey, Bob,
Sure.
I had a little difficulty in accepting I'm gonna call it the conglomeration of the big C capital to create the industry-wide capital.
Yeah.
I had difficulty with rationale for that. That's all.
Okay,
Even
good.
even from Marx's point of view.
Oh, yeah. Well, once again, this is not Marxism. This is more kind of arithmetic logic to start with. The system structure of industries can only be stable if they're all earning the same rate of return. Otherwise, the lower rate of return industry would collapse, would give up capital, surrender capital to the
I
others.
understood that.
Okay. So we get the equality of rates of return. And Marx can go further, but again, this doesn't require Marxism to say, what is that rate of return that everybody converges to? Well, it's got to be the average rate of return, right? Because if anybody is off the average rate of return, then somebody by definition of average has to be below the rate of return. Average rate of return, that industry hemorrhages capital. So it's not they all have the same rate of return, but they also that they have a rate of return equal to the average. Now, here's why we're going to add all that stuff up, the constant capital, because we have to compute that average rate of return. We need the total amount of capital in the economy, and we need to divide that into the surplus value, the profit in the economy, so we get economy-wide the rate of return, the average rate of return, the total amount of surplus value divided by the total amount of capital across the economy. That gives us the average rate of return. By the way, when I said, well, we added 70 and 80, got 150, and the only way we could do that is by converting to labor values. Otherwise, we're adding apples and oranges, ounces and inches. It doesn't make sense. Okay.
That's the part that threw me. I understood all the rest of the math.
Okay. Well, I mean, what part? In other words, if I add 70 smelters and 80 looms, I have 150, and you fill in the blank. 150 what? What is what we have? You muted here. I'm not hearing. Am I the only one?
So when you add it to make 150, what is the 150 that you have? That's the part that.
Okay. Well, the 70 reflects 70 units of labor time that it took to produce that amount of capital, that machinery. We're assuming 100% depreciation. So I'm assuming all the labor time that went into producing the machinery, the smelter, say. Yes. All that labor time is used up in that production cycle, because all that machinery can do is last for one production cycle, and it's got to be replaced. So that represents 70 units of labor time. Now, we're talking about an industry, so I'm not saying 70 hours. There could be thousands of workers in that industry. So 70 could be 70 million hours of labor. It could be 70 billion hours of labor, 70,000 hours. I mean, it just depends on how many workers are in that industry. It's just, we add up all the amount of labor time it took to produce the machinery in that industry. That's the 70. Okay. It could be, again, stand for 70,000, 70 million, 70 billion, whatever. One thing, does that help?
Yeah, it helps. It basically says to me that the capital is its only component is the labor that it took to.
It's sort of working backwards. In other words, you look at a machine, and I said this at the beginning of today's talk. If you look at a machine in the everyday world, you don't see labor, you see a machine. You just see a piece of iron or something like that. But for Marx, it's kind of what that machine is. Remember, he called it dead labor. It is there because of hours and hours of labor that took to manufacture and fabricate that machine. So from the point of view of the labor theory of value, that machine can be translated, so to speak, for economic purposes into all the hours of labor it took to bring that machine to the factory or the factories. There were lots of machines, all the machines in the factories. And
Okay.
suddenly I should mention in the same case with the surplus value, nobody asked, I sort of wondered if somebody would. I said that everybody's earning the same wage. They're earning the exchange value of labor wage, whatever that is, that minimum wage needed to keep body and soul together so they can show up for work. But if you remember, Industry 1 has 20 units, Industry 2 has 30 units. Well, hey, I thought they earned the same wage. It looks like there's more money in Industry 2 than Industry 1. Yes, there's more money in it, so to speak, more money in it. But if every worker's earning the same wage, it simply means that Industry 2 hires 50% more workers than Industry 1. So that 20 in Industry 1 represents, again, could be 20,000 workers, 30,000 workers, 85,000 workers, whatever it is to produce what is equivalent to 20 units of labor time. And that's needed to keep these folks alive. And in the Industry 2 just has more demand for labor. It needs maybe, if the one needs 20,000 workers, the other one needs 30,000 workers.
When does the component of management come into and overhead and other things that are not pure elements of labor?
Yeah, no, that's once again, there's no question here that the machinery is not people. They're solid things. Yeah. So we're just, for accounting purposes, we're converting it to labor values. It's not to pretend that it's really labor. It's embodied labor, dead labor. Okay. In terms of overhead, the factory is overhead. It's part of. I didn't get into these complications. There's a distinction between constant capital and fixed capital. Fixed capital would mean what you have in mind, the overhead, like the factories, things that last for many, many production cycles. That can get figured into that as well. Also, any labor the capitalist as flesh and blood actual capitalist does in the production process, that gets figured into the labor cost of producing that final product. And whoever that person is, they should get rewarded for that labor. But it's that surplus value, is that residual value that comes solely from ownership. But all the different components of the production process, aside from the surplus value, which is simply squeezed from labor it's not paid for, but all the rest is paid for out of the capitalist investment. And yeah, you're right. Some of that is going to be overhead and would be treated for economic and accounting purposes differently than the constant capital that is constantly turned over, that goes, you buy some cloth that has to be converted into a sweater. So that's different than the loom and so on. So yeah, there's a whole debate, and analysis in Marxist economics related to fixed versus constant capital. The fixed being, as I said, that durable, really long-term investment that lasts production cycle to production cycle. That's there. It's just we didn't talk about it.
Okay, all right.
But a good question, yeah. Well,
we'll be back next time. It was great. I love it. It's hard to cover in 3 sessions.
Yeah, I know. It's either you race through it or it turns into a marathon endurance contest.
Yeah.
Week 25 of Marxist. So anyway, but next time we will segue into
the politics.
Into the politics, and the way I want to start it off, just maybe if this is a spoiler, having sort of said Marx was wrong about the falling rate of profit, I'm going to start off with an excerpt from a speech from Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, when Marx suggested capitalism would going to destroy itself, I mean, in 1929, a lot of folks thought that Marx was right.
Yeah.
I mean, it made a lot of converts to capitalism, to communism. I mean, when you read about, writers, we just had the Academy Awards. There was a period of the blacklist where all these communist affiliated writers weren't getting work and so forth. I mean, a lot of these folks converted to communism, became sympathetic to fellow travelers and so forth at a time when capitalism looked like, in a very serious way to any sane, objective person, that it wasn't working. And it just failed
Right.
horribly. And so I want to start with a speech by Roosevelt that sort of recognizes the disaster around him. And Roosevelt was not a socialist. He was very pro-capitalist, but he understood the depth of the wreckage he was inherited when he came into office in March of 1933. So, okay,
Okay.
next time.
All
Thank you,
right, good
everyone.
deal.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.